users and groups. Like with any previous version of Windows, in Windows Vista, you of course need to have a user account before you can log on to your computer. It's this user account that identifies each person that uses the computer and provides permissions to allow or restrict what a user is able to do within Windows Vista. Now behind the scenes, Windows Vista assigns each user account a security identifier, or SID as it's better known, which is a long number that's guaranteed to be unique. Even if you delete your user account and create another one with the same name, the SID will be different. When you first log on to Vista, Windows checks to see that your username and password matches and then creates a security access token, which includes your username and SID along with any groups that your account belongs to. When you try to access a resource on the computer, such as a file or folder, Windows checks the access control list for that resource, and every single resource has one, which is basically a list of SIDs, and depending on the access control list rules, it'll either grant or deny you access to the resource. And a little bit later in this video, we'll show you how to determine what your own user account SID is. Now that Windows Vista is here and includes user account control, any administrator of Vista now has two security access tokens assigned to them. One is for a standard user, and this is used for pretty much everything in Windows, so even though you might be logged on to Vista as an administrator, under the hood you're really only a standard user for most tasks. The other security access token that an administrator has is for things that require the full privileges of an administrator, and it's only called into play when you attempt to perform a task that requires elevated privileges. Now, by the way, even though I did say that all SIDs are unique, there are a couple of exceptions. Built-in accounts like the local system account are common over Windows installations. So if you want a complete list of these, check out this URL here and you'll find a comprehensive list of what these SIDs are. Now, of course, when you first installed Windows Vista, you had to create a user account. So let's go and take a look at the properties of a user account, and then we'll also see how we can create additional user accounts for other people. So we'll click on Start, and we'll right-click on Computer, and we'll select Manage. Now, since accessing the Computer Management Console does require elevated privileges, we'll need to confirm that we do want to load this console, and this is User Account Control in action. Remember we learned earlier that an administrator has two security access tokens? Well, poking around in the operating system uses a standard user account, but when I attempted to load something that requires greater permissions, User Account Control presents this message asking me to confirm that I'm actually sure I want to load this program. And the point really here is to confirm that I in fact do want to launch this program, and it's not some malicious bit of software that I might have downloaded from the internet trying to do something naughty. Now, by the way, if you do leave this screen like this and you don't click anything for 2 minutes, it'll automatically cancel the request for elevated permissions and you won't be allowed to do whatever it is you asked to do. Alright, well, we'll click Continue. And the Computer Management Console will load, so we'll come over here to the left and we'll expand Local Users and Groups. And we'll select the Users folder. Okay, in the middle of our console here we have 3 accounts by default, that being the built-in administrator's account, the built-in guest account, and the account that you created when you installed Windows Vista. So my account here is called Trainer, yours is most likely to be called something else. Okay, well, if we right-click on our Trainer account, we can change or set the password for this account. On the All Tasks menu we can do exactly the same thing. We can delete this account if we no longer require it. We could rename it to something else, and we can check out the properties. So we'll select Properties, and we have 3 tabs here. Now on the General tab, we can provide a full name and a description for this account if we like. And if you're a home user with just 1 or 2 accounts, then you really don't need to fill this in as it is optional. But if you do happen to have a lot of people using this computer, then it's a pretty good idea to complete these fields so it's easier to identify what or who the account is being used for later on. Now, the user must change password at next logon is greyed out, as you can see, but when we create new accounts later on, you'll see that we can enable this feature so that the user we're creating the account for is able to set their own password when they first log onto the computer. And that's a good idea since it saves arguments later on. For example, if I happen to set a user's password and they don't change it, and then something goes wrong with their account, for example, files are deleted or they suspect that someone's been looking at their email, the first person that they'll suspect is you, since you know their password. So by making them change it, you can simply avoid the potential aggravation later on. Now we can also set the accounts that the user can't change their password, which is really the opposite of the previous setting, and this is useful for service accounts that we can use to run programs and we don't want the password to be changed. Now we can also set the password to never expire, and by default the first account you create on Vista, which is automatically going to be an administrator account, will have this set, but for regular users, for best security, you should force users to change their passwords regularly. Now we saw a moment ago that we could delete an account, but we can also disable an account as well if we like, and that's a good security measure, say when a user goes on holiday, for example. Now we know they're coming back, so we don't want to delete their account, but if it's not needed at the moment, we can disable it and re-enable it later on when they come back. Now in fact, if I just move this window across here, we can see that the two inbuilt accounts by default are disabled, and you can see this little downward pointing arrow over the icon, and at a glance this shows you that these accounts are disabled. Now finally, if an account is locked out due to reasons such as a user's entered in the wrong password a certain number of times, they won't be able to log on, so we can come into our console here and then uncheck this box to re-enable their account. Now on the Member Of tab, we can see all of the groups that this account belongs to, and my trainer account here of course belongs to the administrator group, but we can add or remove our accounts from other groups by using these buttons below. Now finally, on the Profile tab, if you want to use a mandatory or roaming user profile, you can enter in a UNC path for where you want this user's profile to be stored, and most of the items on this tab aren't really likely to be used by home users anyway. But if we want, we can assign a logon script for this user. We can simply enter in the path to the script here. We can also change the home folder path of the users folder, which in my case will default to the users folder on my C drive in a folder called Trainer, but we can change it if we like. And finally, if we'd like to map this user's folder to a network drive, we can specify a drive letter and then a UNC path to the folder. Now, like I said, for a client operating system, it's unlikely that you'll ever use these features here, but in a domain environment, you most likely will. But these options will be configured in Active Directory rather than here, but at least if you didn't know what they did, now you do. Alright, so if we want to add a new user account to Vista, we'll simply right-click and we'll select New User. Now we'll need to give this new user a name, so I'm just going to call this new user Bob, and we can also enter in an optional full name for this account and a description as well. Now next, we'll need to enter in a password for Bob's account, and we'll need to type it in twice just to confirm it. Now the default is for Bob to have to change his password the first time he logs onto this computer, and we've already spoken about that, but if we uncheck this box though, then the next two options here become available, so that we can set Bob's account so that he either can't change his password or set it to never expire. Now finally down the bottom, if we were creating this account ahead of time but we don't need to use it yet, we could set it to disable. Now it's pretty unlikely in a home environment that you'll really need to use this disable feature, but in a corporate environment where people come and go, this could be used quite frequently. Okay, well I'm going to set Bob's account so that he has to change his password on his next logon, which of course will be his first logon, and we'll click the Create button. Alright, now Bob's account has been created and this window does stay open in case you need to create more accounts, so I'm going to click Close, and there we can see Bob's account, which is enabled, ready for him to log on. Now we can also create accounts from a different place in Windows Vista, so if we go and click on Start, we'll fire up the control panel, and up here on the top right we'll choose Add or Remove User Accounts, and we'll need to confirm that. So here from this window you can see that we currently have our two accounts that we've created, our trainer account, which we created when we installed Vista, and our Bob account, which we just created a moment ago. Now this window here definitely makes it easier for a home user with little knowledge of Windows to be able to create accounts. So all we need to do is click Create a New Account, and then simply enter in a new account name. So I'm going to enter in Jane, and all I need to do is to decide whether Jane needs to be a standard user or an administrator. So I'm going to leave the default here at standard, and we'll click the Create Account button. Okay, so there's Jane's account created, ready to use. But this method does have one small problem. Jane's account doesn't have a password, and as such it isn't secure at all. Now though, that might be fine for some home users to have their computers set up that way, but personally, I'd never create an account without a password. And at a glance, if you haven't already picked up on it, you can see that under Jane's icon here, it doesn't say password protected, but yet you can see that the other ones do. So let's fix this. So we'll click on Jane's account, and you can see we've got a few options here. We could change Jane's account name, we can create a password, we can change the picture that's been assigned to Jane's account, we could set up parental controls to track or restrict what Jane's getting up to on her computer, and we'll talk about that in another video. We can change her account type from a standard account, which it's currently set to now, to an administrator account and vice versa, and we can delete her account. So let's go and create a password, and we will get this bold warning here telling us that if we do create a password for Jane, she will lose any encrypted files, personal certificates, and stored passwords. So do bear that in mind if you plan on changing an account that's been in use for a while, as you'll want to unencrypt any saved files first. But that's okay here for us since this is a new account and Jane hasn't logged on so far, so I'm going to enter in a password for Jane's account, and we'll need to type it in again just to confirm it. And if you like, we could also create a password hint as well, something that could jog Jane's memory to what her password is in case she forgets it, but that's entirely optional. So we'll go here, we'll click on Create Password, and we're done. Now if you're feeling a little bit more adventurous, you can also create user accounts from the command prompt as well, although you will need to open up the command prompt in administrator mode or you'll be denied the ability to create any new accounts. So we'll go and click on Start, and we'll type in CMD, and we'll hold down the Control and Shift keys on our keyboard and hit Enter. And then we'll need to click Continue on our user account control message. And at the top of our title bar here in our command prompt, you can see that we are running in administrator mode. Alright, so we'll type in net user, and if we just hit enter now without providing any other additional arguments, we'll get back a list of the accounts we currently have on our system, and there should be 5 now. We've got the built-in administrator and guest accounts, of course, which are disabled by default, and the 3 that I've created. We've got Bob, Jane, and the trainer account. Okay, so to add in a new account, we'll run our net user command again, followed by the add switch, and then the name of the new user. So let's call this new user Joe, and if we hit enter right now, Joe's account will be created, but he won't have a password. And we'll verify that. We'll go back to our control panel here. In fact, we'll go back to user accounts and we'll need to load this again. So we'll choose manage another account. Okay, there's Joe's account. We can see it's not password protected. So let's quickly go and delete Joe's account. We'll go back to our computer management here. We'll just refresh this, and I'm just going to right click and choose delete on his account. Okay, well let's go back to our command prompt and let's rerun our command, and we'll give Joe's account a password. So we'll reissue the same command, net user add Joe, and after this we'll just enter in a password, and I'm just going to give him a password of password. So we'll hit enter. We can see that worked fine. We'll go back to our computer management console and we'll refresh this, and there's Joe's account. So if we go back to our Manage Accounts again, and we'll just reopen that. Now we can see Joe's account is in fact password protected. Alright, well let's quickly go back to our command prompt here, since I did tell you earlier in this video that I'd show you how to determine what your own SID is. Now if we use the whoami command with the /user switch, this will return the account that you're currently logged on with along with your own security identifier. So if you need to find out this information, you can see the SID here for the trainer account. Alright, well let's go back to our control panel for a moment. So I'm just going to click on Start and launch our control panel. And we'll come over here and we'll click on User Accounts and Family Safety. And then the green User Accounts link. And over here on the left, we have the ability to create a password reset disk just in case you happen to forget your password. Now this starts up a small wizard, but before we just dive in and click Next, if you read this text here, you'll note that whilst this password reset disk that we're about to create will allow you to create a new password and log onto your computer if you get in trouble or forget your password, if somebody else gets hold of your disk, they too will be able to change your password and log on and access your own files. So bear that in mind if you do plan on leaving the disk lying around for others to find. Alright, well we'll click Next and we'll be asked where we want to save the disk to, which in my case defaults to my A drive, so we'll click Next again. And we need to enter in our current password, so it's a good idea to run through this now while you still remember what your password is. So we'll simply enter in our password here, and then we'll click Next. And you will be prompted to put the floppy disk in the drive if you don't have one in the drive at the moment. And I do, and you can see that my password disk here has been created automatically. Well, it's done. It's pretty quick, so we'll click Next, and then we'll click Finish. Okay, now we can store our disk safely, just in case we need to call on it later on if we forget our password. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log off this computer and we'll see how we can use our new password disk to reset our password. So I've just logged off and we're here at the familiar logon screen that you've all seen before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter in an incorrect password first. And we're told here that our username or password is incorrect. So we'll click on OK. And now, underneath our password box here, we've got a new option to reset our password. So we'll select that. And this will fire up the password reset wizard. So we'll click Next. And we'll be prompted to choose which drive has the password reset disk, so make sure you've got it in the drive. Now mine defaults to the A drive, which is correct, so we'll click Next. And now we'll need to enter in a new password, so we'll type one in and we'll type it in again. Of course, we can also enter in an optional hint that might help us remember our password later on. I'll skip that, we'll choose Next. Okay, and we're done. Our password has now been changed, and once we click Finish, we'll now be able to log on using the new password. But just keep that in mind, that if anyone else finds your password reset disk, they'll be able to reset your password just as easy as you saw me do it right now. So make sure if you are going to use that password reset disk, that you keep that disk in a safe place. Okay, well let's move on, as there is another thing we should take a look at before wrapping up our discussion of user accounts, and that's taking a look at the local security policy. So we'll click on Start, we'll fire up the control panel, we'll then select System and Maintenance, and down the bottom we'll select the Administrative Tools, and now we can launch the local security policy. Now it's rather a lot of clicks to get to this place, so if you'd prefer, we can add this window here to our Start menu. So we'll right click on our Start button, we'll select Properties, then we'll choose the Customize button, and we'll scroll all the way down to the bottom, and we'll choose to display our administrative tools on the All Programs menu and the Start menu, and we'll click on OK. And then we'll click OK again, and now if we click Start, we have the administrative tools here, and we can simply launch our local security policy that way. Alright, now we'll click on the user account control message. And in our local security policy window, we'll come over here and we'll expand account policies, and then we'll select the password policy. Now I will say up front that most of the policies that you see in here, most users of Vista, especially home users, won't ever touch or perhaps even know that they exist. But they do exist, of course, and making changes here can make your Vista computer even more secure. Now these policies aren't new to Vista, they were there in XP as well, of course, so let's go and take a look at them. Alright, now the first policy we have here is the Enforce Password History. Now this keeps track of the passwords that we've used in the past. Now you can see it's currently set to 0, which is basically the same as saying this policy here is disabled. Now what this policy does is maintains a list of passwords that a user has used in the past, and if they change their current password, they won't be able to change it back to a password that they have used in the past. So if we set this policy to any value other than 0, then that number of passwords will be remembered. This means that when we create a user's account, and let's say we set this value to 2, then our user later on changes their password to something else, then they won't be able to go back and reuse the same password they had before until they've at least cycled through 2 other passwords. Now on a default installation of Windows Server 2003, this number is set to 24. Now here, it's obviously 0, which is disabled, but if you want to force users to create new unique passwords, then set this to a higher value, and that will make them have to think of new passwords more frequently. And since you now know how to create a password reset disk, then a forgotten password isn't the end of the world. So to change any of these values, simply right-click on the policy, select Properties, and then we can change the value to whatever you like. Okay, well our next setting here, maximum password age, is currently set to 42 days, so users will only be able to use the same password for 42 days before they're forced to change it. Now next we have the minimum password age, and this setting works with the maximum password age in the sense that it's the best practice to have a minimum amount of time before a user can change their password. Now the reason for this setting is that, let's say a user has a favourite password. All this user would theoretically have to do once this 42 days maximum password age is up is change their password as many times as this value is set to, and then they can now reuse their old favourite password. So by having a minimum time here of set to say at least a day, then users will have to use the new password for at least 1 day before they can change it. This means that the users are going to have to use a new password for at least 1 day. Now sure, after that 1 day they could go back to their old favourite password, but if you set this to something higher like 24, which is the default setting on a Windows server, then users are going to get sick of trying to change their password, that's for sure. But that said, the default for Windows Vista, as you can see, is set to 0, which is disabled, so even after 42 days we're going to force our users to change their password. There's nothing stopping them from changing it back to the old one straight away. Now next we have the minimum password length, which defaults to 0 characters, which isn't very good from a security standpoint. Now this means that accounts can have a really small password like a single letter or number, or even worse, no password at all. So personally, I'd change this to force users to at least create a 7 or 8 character password. Now the next setting here is one that is turned on by default on all Windows 2003 server operating systems, and in all honesty, it should be turned on here as well. Password must meet complexity requirements. So let's take a closer look at what these complexity requirements are. Complexity requirements, when you enforce them, means that in order to successfully use a password, it must meet or exceed these requirements listed here. It must not contain part or all of the user's username. So if our user Bob we created earlier was changing his password and we were enforcing these complexity requirements, then he'd be unable to use the password Bob, or even Bob123, since it contains his username of Bob. The password must also be a minimum of 6 characters. Any less than that, and the new password will be rejected. Of course, more than 6 characters is allowed, and for security purposes, it's also recommended that you have a good long password. Of course, the only downside to having a long password is that it's more of a pain for you to type in, but the longer and more complex it is, the better your security. Now, a complex password must also contain characters from at least 3 of these following 4 categories. It can use any uppercase character from A to Z. It can use any lowercase character from A to Z. It can use any of the 0 through to 9 numeric characters. And finally, it can use special characters like those you see here, most of which are of course entered in via the keyboard by holding down the Shift key and then pressing one of the numeric keys. So down the bottom here you can see that the word password, which is a popular password out there in the world, doesn't meet these complexity requirements. So if you're applying this policy, then that password won't work. Now this version of the word password, on the other hand, does meet complexity requirements. It does contain at least 1 uppercase character, as well as a special character, and of course, 1 or more lowercase characters. Now the password itself is 8 characters in length, and that of course meets the requirement for the minimum number of characters, which is 6. I will note, however, that variations on the word password is still not a great password as far as security is concerned, but we're only just using this for our example, so choose something far less crackable for your own benefit. And you could even consider making this more secure by taking other letters and then replacing them with numbers. So here we've replaced the letter S with the number 5 and the letter O with the number 0. Again, even though this is a far more secure password than using the actual word password, variants on the word password aren't particularly recommended, so use your brain and think of something else. Okay, well, that's the complexity requirements for a user's password in Vista, which of course we can see it is disabled, and personally I'd enable it for better security, but at the end of the day it's up to you. Now if you do enable this policy, users that you may have already created earlier without passwords or weak passwords that don't meet this requirement, they'll still be able to log on just fine. It just means that the next time they change their password, or if you create a new user account from then on, these complexity requirements will be enforced at that time. So by enabling this policy, everything will stay the same until the next password change or any new user accounts are created, and only then will these complexity requirements kick in. Now before we close the local security policy, we'll take a look at the last setting here, storing passwords using reversible encryption. Now as it sounds, enabling this policy will store passwords using encryption that is reversible, and storing passwords using reversible encryption is basically the same as storing them in plain text, which is rubbish as far as security is concerned. So don't enable this policy unless you have applications that require knowledge of a user's password for authentication purposes. However, this policy will be required to be enabled if you are using the Challenge Handshake authentication protocol through remote access or internet authentication services, or if you're using digest authentication in IIS. Obviously the default setting here is of course disabled, so unless you do have a need to enable it, then just leave it as it is. Alright, well the next thing we really need to talk about in this video is creating groups. Now when you only have a single user on your Vista computer, groups are really unnecessary. However, when the number of users grows, even with one more user added to the computer, groups start to become a rather attractive option. So let's say for argument's sake that you have 2 or more users need access to a folder on your computer. Without groups, you'll need to explicitly add each user to the access control list and assign them the appropriate permissions. Groups can help you simplify administration on your computer, since it's far easier to create a group and then place a bunch of user accounts into that group and assign permissions to the group. Okay, so let's go and create a group, and we'll talk more about this on the way. So we'll go and launch our computer management console again. We'll click on Start, we'll right-click on Computer, and we'll select Manage, and we'll click Continue on our user account control message. And then we'll come over here, we'll expand Local Users and Groups, and we'll select Groups. Now in the right-hand side here, or rather the middle of our console, we can see a bunch of groups that come built into Windows. Alright, well let's just talk for a little bit about these inbuilt groups, since some of you listening to this video might not be fully aware of what they're used for. Okay, well firstly we have the Administrators group, which is the most powerful user account in Windows. It pretty much lets you do anything you want to do on your computer, but don't forget though, if user account control is active on your Vista system, you'll still be bound by its security features, but at the end of the day, if your account is a member of the Administrators group, then you can override user account control and make system-wide changes to practically anything, as well as access other users' files and folders, and also assign permissions to other user accounts. Now the next group is the Backup Operators group, and this allows its members to back up and restore files on this computer regardless of your permissions. This means that if your account is a member of this group, you can back up files that you might not ordinarily have access to. Now you mightn't be able to open, view or run these files, but you can back it up and restore it. Now next we have the Cryptographic Operators group, and as the description says, members of this group are able to perform cryptographic operations. The Distributed COM Users group allows a user to launch and use DCOM objects. We have the Event Log Reader, and members of this group can read and access the event logs on this computer. We have the Guest group, which grants the same rights as a standard user to the person logging onto Vista, except that members of this group will have their user profile deleted when the user logs off the computer, whereas a regular member of the Users group down the bottom here will have their profile remain on the computer when they log off. So a guest user, every time they log on, will create a temporary default user profile, and if they log off and log back on again, they're always going to revert back to new fresh settings. Okay, well the next group we have is the IIS group, which is a group that is used by Internet Information Services to access content on behalf of anonymous users that are requesting web pages from your Vista computer. Now IIS isn't enabled by default, and in another video we'll talk more about IIS. Now next we have the Network Configuration Operators group, which grants its members the ability to make changes to TCP/IP network settings, such as change the IP address of this computer, or release a DHCP address and renew it, and so on. We have Performance Log Users, and this allows the user to manage performance logs, performance counters, and alerts both on this local computer and remote computers. Now next we have the Performance Monitor Users group, and members of this group can monitor performance counters on this computer and remote ones. Okay, now it's important to understand that for the next group, the Power Users group, is only there for backwards compatibility for older operating systems. Now in previous Windows operating systems, you'd often have situations where users need a greater authority to do things than a standard user account provided, such as the ability to install applications or to run an application with greater permissions. And ordinarily, you'd need to add their user account into either the Administrators group or the Power Users group. In Vista, we're now doing away with this Power Users group, but it is still there just in case you need it, but it doesn't give you any more permissions than a standard user account does. Okay, well the next group we have is the Remote Desktop Users group, which allows you to log on remotely to this computer using Remote Desktop, and by default only the administrators have access to log on remotely. Now next we have the Replicator group, which is here for replication functions, and you won't need to add any local accounts ever to this group. It's only there for domain accounts that need to log on to this computer in order to support logging on to the replication service. And finally we have the Standard Users folder, which we've talked about already. Alright, now with these explanations out of the way, let's go and create our own group. So to do that, we'll simply right click and we'll choose New Group. Now we will need to give our group a name, so I'm just going to call this group here Sales, and we can provide an optional description if we like. Now we'll need to add in some members for our group, since a group without any members really isn't much use. So we'll come down here, we'll click on the Add button, and now we're going to add in accounts from this computer, Vista Client 01. Now if you already know the name of the user account, you can type it in here, or at least part of it. So if we wanted to add in the user account for Jane, which we created earlier in this video, we could simply type in Jane, and we could click on the Check Names button, and it will find and populate the full user account for Jane for us, which is this computer name /Jane. Now alternatively, if you don't know the correct spelling of the account that you want to add, we can click on the Advanced button here, and then the Find Now button, and then you can choose one or more accounts from this list. Okay, so let's go and add in Bob, so we'll select his account, and if we scroll down, and we'll hold down Control on our keyboard and we'll select Jane as well, so you can see that we've got both of these currently selected. Then we'll click on OK. There's both of the accounts populated in our box for us, so we'll click on OK again. And there we can see both Bob and Jane's account have been added to our new sales group. So we'll click on the Create button, and then we'll click Close, and there we can see our new group has been added. Okay, now that we have a group created, it's much easier for us to now manage permissions, since we can now assign our sales group permissions to a resource such as a file or a folder. And then all members of this group, in this case Bob and Jane, will have permission to access it, and we only need to assign that permission once to the group and not for each user account individually. Of course, if you only have a single user on your Vista computer, then groups won't really be much use to you. But if you have lots of people using your computer, then creating groups and assigning permissions to the group is much easier to manage and quicker to get things happening. Also, when you need to add another user to the group later on, as they also might need access to certain files and folders, then by adding the user to the group, they'll immediately have access to everything that the sales group has access to. Now we can also create groups at a command prompt as well, using the net command we saw earlier when we created our user accounts. So we'll go and click on Start, we'll type in CMD, and we'll hold down Control and Shift and hit Enter, and we'll need to click Continue. Now just verify by looking at the top here in our title bar that you are in fact running in administrator mode. Otherwise our commands here will fail. So we'll type in net followed by local group, and if we just hit Enter now without providing any additional arguments, we'll get back a list of the groups that we currently have on our system. And here we can see all of the built-in groups, so the administrator, backup operators group, and so on. And we can also see right here, there's our sales group down the bottom that we created a moment ago. So to create a new group, we'll enter in net local group followed by the add switch, since we're creating a new group. And by the way, if you do want to delete a group from the command line, simply just change add to delete, followed by the name of the group, and you can delete a group that way. Okay, but we want to add a group, so we'll use the add switch, and we'll need to supply a name of the group we want to add. So let's just call this group Marketing, and we'll hit Enter, and we're done. We can see our command completed successfully. So if we go back to our computer management console and we refresh by hitting F5 on our keyboard, there we can see our new marketing group has been created and we're ready to add in our members. Okay, in this video we've seen just how simple it is to create local users and local groups on a Windows Vista machine. Now just remember that when you add in new user accounts to Vista from within the control panel application, that they aren't required to have a password by default, and from a security perspective, that's a very bad idea. Now also keep it in mind that if you've got a really bad memory and you're always forgetting your passwords, we saw that we can have the password reset disk option in the control panel, which can really help you get out of a jam later on. Of course now, you just need to remember where you left that disk.